Imagine racing through the gritty streets of London in a high stakes car chase, weaving through traffic as bullets fly past your window. In 2002, The Getaway aimed to blur the line between video games and movies, delivering a cinematic experience that captured the essence of London's underworld. Combining fast paced action, intense car chases, and a narrative ripped straight from British gangster films, The Getaway was Sony's ambitious answer to the rise of open world crime games. Today, we're diving into the development and legacy of The Gateway, a game that sought to bring realism and storytelling to the forefront of gaming. So buckle up and join us for today's high-octane trip down memory card lane. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. I hope these words find you well. Hello and welcome to the 224th episode of our Video Game History Podcast, a trip down memory card lane. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game or the people that have created it. It can be about a console or the technology that brought it to life. We often talk about the companies that bring it all together, making our hobby, video games, a reality. While telling you each story, we hope to teach you something new about the topic, what it took from the world as its inspiration, or what it gave back to the world as its legacy. Today, we're diving into The Getaway, released for the PlayStation 2 on December 11th, 2002. I'm David Casson, and as always, I'm joined by my co-host, who's probably better off navigating a digital getaway than a real-life one. He's my brother, Rob Casson. So, Rob, if you were involved in a high-speed chase like, those in a getaway, do you think you'd be able to escape without taking down half the city?
Not likely.
Yeah, you very destructive person.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Just don't care about anything. Just gotta go for gold.
You just there's a lot of stuff that's breakable, and sometimes it happens.
Sometimes it just needs to be broken.
Yeah.
That's what it was made for. They wouldn't call it breakable if it wasn't made to be broken.
See, you're understanding now.
I do. I get it very much. I get it very much. All right. Well, before we get into the gate, I'm going to call it the gateway all day. Before we get into the getaway, why don't you tell our listeners what else has happened during this week in gaming history?
All right, kicking it off on December 9th, 1988, Ninja Gaiden was released for the Nintendo Entertainment System in Japan, developed and published by Tecmo. Known for its fast-paced action, tight controls, and cinematic storytelling, Ninja Gaiden follows the story of Ryu Hayabusa, a skilled ninja on a quest to avenge his father's death and prevent an ancient evil from being unleashed. The game became iconic for challenging difficulty and its use of cutscenes to deliver a dramatic narrative, a rarity at that time. Ninja Gaiden was widely praised for its gameplay mechanics, fluid animations, and engaging story, and it is regarded as one of the most influential action platformers of the 8-bit era, spawning multiple sequels and solidifying Ryu Hayabusa as a key figure in gaming history. We covered this back in episode 27, so go give it a listen if you want to learn more.
We also covered its 2004-ish reboot when they rebooted the series in the mid hundreds, I think was that episode. So if you want to learn about either Ninja Gaiden, it's one of the few series we've done old and new. Give them both a listen. How's that?
Yeah, do that.
That. All right. What else we got?
Well, on November 10th, 1993, Doom was released by id Software, revolutionizing the gaming industry and defining the first-person shooter genre. Set on a Martian moon overrun by mnemonic forces, the game combined fast-paced gameplay, immersive 3D graphics, and networked multiplayer deathmatches, which became a cultural phenomenon. Widely regarded as one of the most influential games of all time, Doom popularized first-person shooters, showcased the potential of modding and shareware distribution, and left a lasting legacy on gaming history. We learned about this back on episode 15, so go check it out if you want to learn more.
Yeah, early modding, early shareware, early. The mod files were called WADs. Get to learn all about WADs.
Yeah, I'm sure you'd love to learn about those WADs.
Tee 'em up, no 'em run. That was easy.
Ah, jeez.
I know. Doom's a great game. Doom is on toasters. I think didn't we talk about how someone put Doom on a pregnancy test even?
It's probable. Yeah, I wouldn't
Yeah.
doubt it. It sounds
Yeah.
familiar.
If there is something that can run a basic program, someone has recreated Doom on it. That's safe to say. It's probably one of the most ported games of all time.
Very true. Next up, on December 11th, 1999, Gran Turismo 2 was released for the PlayStation, expanding on the groundbreaking formula of its predecessor to deliver one of the most comprehensive racing games of all time. Developed by Polyphony Digital, the game featured over 600 cars, 27 tracks, and a variety of racing modes, including a more extensive simulation mode and an arcade mode for casual play. Praised for realistic driving physics, expansive content, and visual fidelity, Gran Turismo 2 cemented the series' reputation as a benchmark for racing games. Its depth and accessibility appealed to both car enthusiasts and gamers, making it a defining title for the PlayStation era.
That was a labor of love that they made that and hit it in another game for at first. The first Gran Turismo. We did a whole episode on the first Gran Turismo. That's a fascinating series. I think we did it at the end of like this week last year. So go give that a listen if you want to learn about how Gran Turismo came to be all the way from Modu. I might have problems talking tonight, Rob. Be ready. All the way from Motor Tune Grand Prix to the Gran Turismo series. So there you go.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Moving on to the 2000s, in December 8th, 2003, Black Isle Studios, the renowned developer behind classic RPGs like Baldur's Gate, Icewind Dale, and Planescape Torment, was officially shut down by its parent company, Interplay Entertainment. Known for innovative storytelling, deep world building, and genre defining mechanics, Black Isle played a pivotal role in shaping Western RPGs during its tenure. At the time of its closure, the studio was working on the highly anticipated Fallout 3, which is codenamed Van Buren, but that was ultimately canceled. Despite its untimely end, Black Isle's legacy lives on through its influential games and the continued success of the developers, who carried its spirit into new projects at other studios.
Black Isle people went all over the place.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Last up, on December 12th, 2004, Sony launched the PlayStation Portable in Japan, marking its entry into the handheld gaming market. The PSP was a technological marvel for its time, featuring a high resolution, widescreen display, advanced graphics capabilities, and multimedia functionality, including music, movies, and internet browsing. It launched with titles like Ridge Racer and Metal Gear Acid, showcasing the device's ability to deliver console quality gaming on the go. Praised for its sleek design and versatility, the PSP became a significant competitor to Nintendo's dominance in handheld gaming, selling over 80 million units worldwide and cementing its place as a pioneering device in portable entertainment.
You have a PSP?
I do.
What do you like playing on it?
I mostly played a lot of Final Fantasy Dissidia.
The PSP was never in my library. That is definitely a gap for me. Never got into handheld around then. Or maybe I just had a DS back then. I think I just had a DS back then.
You would have had a DS for sure, because that was before the PSP.
Yeah, I had a DS because I had an original Mario DS all done up with the stickers and everything. And I had it for a long time too.
Yeah.
Boy, bay. Rob,
Yeah,
so Team Soho, have you ever heard of Team Soho before?
can't say I have.
Team Soho was a first party development studio for Sony Computer Entertainment. It was based out of Soho, London. Founded in 1994, it said that most of its initial employees were recent college graduates with little to no experience in the video game industry. The first game that Team Soho ever created was a game called NBA Shootout, released in 1996, which was received very well for its time. It was a polygon based basketball game with 3D graphics. That's the mid 90s. We've talked before many times about how games were transitioning into games were transitioning into 3D graphics. First we went from no 3D to polygon 3D, and then we went polygons to textures, and then from there we took off into advancing into where we are now, slowly but surely. So NBA Shootout was Sony's version of that. EA was dominating the sports market with titles like, NBA, right? They make their own series. You know what I mean? So Sony was trying to compete with that, and NBA Shootout was their competition. They quickly followed that up with NBA Shootout 97, no doubt hoping to make that into a yearly franchise. They almost got their wish. NBA Shootout, if I remember correctly, was around until 2004, and I believe between 96 and 2004, only 1 year was missed for whatever reason. So it was almost a yearly franchise for as long as Sony was trying to compete. In the realm of sports. Once upon a time, we had competition there. We had the Sega 2K series, and Sony had these, and EA was doing their thing. So we used to have competition, and then we didn't. In 1997, the team developed a game called Porsche Challenge. Porsche Challenge, no surprising, not surprisingly, is a racing game which consisted of the Porsche license. So you basically raced Porsche boxers against Porsche boxers. Not too shabby.
Not at all.
That same year, they took their racing expertise and they created a game called Rapid Racer. I guess rapid could mean fast, but also in this case it means water, so to speak, because it was a motorboat racing game. Don't see many of those.
No, definitely not. I mean, yeah, I can't think of very many other than maybe one.
Wave Race 64 for the win. I don't know of any others. That's a jet ski one, isn't it?
Yeah, that I think that is. I don't know. The one I'm thinking of actually wasn't even a racing game. It was just you drove a boat. Um,
What do you drive a boat in?
it was like something dragon for the NES
Oh, Cobra
or
Triangle?
yeah, that's it.
Yeah, I was thinking about that the whole time, but that's not really racing. But
Nope, it's
your
not.
train of thought is perfect. You're right. I loved Cobra Triangle. Oh my god, did I love Cobra Triangle? I should look and see if that's a story worth telling sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah, it should come as no surprise, Rob, that a British video game studio out of London was asked to create Spice World, which was the music game that featured the Spice Girls during the height of the Spice Girls phenomenon. Were you a fan of the Spice Girls?
Mm, can't quite say that I was, dude.
I think that they were no longer around by the time you probably had your own taste in music. So
Yeah, a little before me.
yeah. So they made a game that featured the music from the Spice Girls, and that was called Spice World. That came out for the PlayStation in 1998. So Team Soho was consistent. They had, ouch, damn it, cat. Okay, cat just attacked me. That's cool. They were consistent. Yearly they had yearly titles, right? Porsche Challenge and Rapid Racing and the NBA Shootout. They were doing things every year. And that kept going. From 99 to 2001, the studio published yearly editions of a game called This Is Football. That's soccer to us American, uncivilized people, so to speak. This Is Football was a European football soccer/soccer video game that featured real licensed players in the English Football League. So it wasn't exactly trying to compete with FIFA, but everything that's soccer related is trying to compete with FIFA at the same time. But as the team was working on their football games at this time, there was an idea that was being explored elsewhere in the studio. So as the team was wrapping up Porsche Challenge, as it was working on Porsche Challenge, the studio director or director of development at the time for Team Soho was a guy named Brendan McNamara. Now, in all honesty, the internet is kind of devoid of most anything about McNamara before his time. There's probably various reasons now why that'll never happen. We know that he was a writer. He has a random, if you look at his IMDb, he has a random director credit for a TV show in the mid 90s out of Australia. He was Australian, we know that much. But really, his like one of his earliest video game credits on Moby Games, which is where I pull a lot of data, was as studio director on This Is Football in 1999. There are a few earlier credits that are a little different. He has some, like, thank you. You know how at the end of games they say thank you in a lot of games, Rob?
Yeah,
So there are a bunch of thank yous in a couple of games by an Australian gaming studio called Ratbag. That's a good one.
that's
Ratbag.
fantastic.
One of the games was called Power Slide, which came out in 98, and another was called Dirt Track Racing, which came out in 99. And then in 1999, he also has a credit on the design team for a game called Kingsley's Adventure, which was created by Psygnosis. Now, we know from a 2002 interview with IGN that Brendan McNamara worked for Psygnosis for quite some time. That's about the only inkling that we have anywhere that I could find, in the time I had to dig without, without anything else, that he worked for Psygnosis for some time. Now, we've talked about Psygnosis before. I They were a Sony, partner with Sony as the PlayStation came out. They came up in that episode. We also talked about them, I think, the first time in our Lemmings episode. They helped publish Lemmings because they were a publisher alongside DMA Design before DMA went on to create the Grand Theft Auto series. So they were a partner. So they were a partner of DMA and all of that, as they were building up success. The studio actually became part of Sony's publishing group in 1993, and it was during that time that Studio Camden was set up, which is kind of like of a satellite studio of Psygnosis, and then this Sony Computer Entertainment, so Studio Camden. And that Studio Camden is kind of where my understanding is that McNamara was working on Kingsley's Adventure. Try keeping all that straight. Just kind of going off little bits of interviews all here. Psygnosis kind of ended up on being swallowed by. They kind of end up being swallowed up by Sony, so to speak. Eventually, Sony was trying to consolidate, and they were bringing all their random studios under the Sony banner name. So, and that was definitely one of them. No doubt that was definitely one of them. So, Psygnosis will later become Sony Computer Entertainment Studio Liverpool. But before it was Studio Liverpool, it was Psygnosis, and that was the environment that McNamara worked in before he landed a job as a studio head, director of development at Team Soho. When the team was wrapping up Porsche Challenge, McNamara saw the potential for like a free roaming vehicle game, right? And he wanted the team to kind of explore that concept. That's kind of where he was going with everything. Part of the studio is working on This Is Football and what Rapid Racer and all those in after 97. Well, another part of the studio is actually working towards creating this prototype for the Sony PlayStation of a free roaming vehicle game. They're laying down the basis of it, basically recreating some stuff. They created 3 levels to show the concept and its viability to the higher ups at Sony. I mean, for all purposes, they had a working demo. They had put screenshots in one month's episode or issue of one of the Sony magazines. So there was stuff going on in this respect, but they didn't really have a game yet. They just had a, let's call it a technology demo, you know? And then the team saw Driver. We've talked about Driver before. I've talked a lot about Driver. Driver was the first game I remember having working traffic lights. It was an open world, not really open. Yeah, I guess it was open world, but it was a free roaming video game. And it was one of the games that blew my mind at the time because it showed that we had working traffic lights. We had a living world that you could drive through and had to obey traffic laws when the police came after you. And like that was such a novel concept in the mid 90s, right? That was
I'm
I
sure it
think
was.
I think that was 97, 98. And so the team saw Driver and they thought about how they could make it better. They basically asked themselves, how could I do better than this free roaming driving game? How can we add to this free roaming driving game? Now, the one thing you know about Driver is it was fantastic driving game, not so fantastic when you had to get out of your car. Thankfully, there wasn't a lot of that. But when you did have to get out of your car, it was trash. I mean, thankfully they never leaned on that. By this time, though, the Sony themselves and all the developers were starting to transition over to the PlayStation 2, right? Because that was early 2000s. So the team got their hands on a PS2 dev kit and basically said, okay, well, we're going to take what we've learned with this first technology demo and we're going to do something bigger and better. So they sat down and they basically recreated Piccadilly Square. And once they saw what they were able to do with faithfully recreating a real world location that they were all familiar with, they began to expand on those ideas because that gave them the confidence that they needed to continue going down that path, you know? McNamara said in a 2002 IGN interview, so we thought, well, if we're going to go for it and have this big environment, and if it's just going to be tracks, why can't we make it free roaming? Once it became free roaming, it all snowballed because we all had these game design ideas. We also had the idea that if the building is going to look fantastic, then the people have to look fantastic. One thing led to another. We started scanning people so they look good. Then they fit in the environment, but they were sort of good looking trees. They looked great, but they didn't do anything. So then we had to take it to the next step. How are we going to get performances into these characters? How are we going to make them look real? How are we going to get the animation system working? So it just, someone said, I want to try this, and they recreated it, and then take the trees. You get good looking trees, and then how can we kick that up a notch? Well, now we need to make the trees move, right? Because that's the realism part. Then they have to spend all this time to get, the animation going. It basically is a snowball effect, is what he's trying to say there. So as they're kind of building out this concept, right? Making it bigger, making it better, showing people what they're doing, recreating, this, deciding that they can recreate real life is essentially what they're doing. Word comes out that there's a competing studio called Bizarre Creations, and Bizarre Creations was getting a lot of attention over their racing game, which was called Metropolis Street Racer. And Metropolis Street Racer was faithfully recreating some of London itself for the Sega Dreamcast. And the team basically looked at that. Team Soho looked at that, and they said, "Well, we can do that, but bigger." So Sony took what they were hearing from Team Soho and they ran with it. Right? Metropolis Street Racer is basically being put out there. It's being hyped up as one of the killer applications for the Dreamcast. So Sony saw this as an opportunity to compete with Sega and announced their own killer app for the PlayStation 2. They basically came out and said, we can one up Street Racer. They recreate part of London, we'll recreate all of London. All 70 square miles of the city. So a decision was made to faithfully recreate London and to create a character based game where they would, again, make the people and write a story. Writing was where McNamara came from. We'll write a story and we'll base things around it. In the same interview, McNamara said, when we set out with the original design, we wanted to make it as widely available as possible. So people who liked an action movie might potentially buy the Getaway instead of just making it a hardcore gamer's game. When pressed about the inspirations that they based it off of, he noted, well, loads of movies and books as well. But the original kind of movies that we looked at for feel more than anything was Get Carter, with Michael Caine. And then Mona Lisa, and obviously the Lock Stock series. A lot of Lungston. That's a great word I put together there, just making it up. A lot of London gangster movies. There was a kind of rush on them for a while. Face, that was another good one. Robert Carlyle and Ray Winston. So basically they're a British company and they want to make a good story, so they turned to British gangster movies and said we're gonna make a British gangster story of our own, but as a video game. So the hype train was there, and like I said, they wanted to compete with Bizarre Creations. They wanted to make the killer app for the PlayStation 2, and they got out in the world and they said, "Hey, we're gonna recreate all 70 square miles of London." That's I don't know if anything's even done that to this day. I don't know if anything has. Can you think of something? I mean, what's been in London? Like the Division, maybe?
Grand Theft Auto London.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. But that was before this, wasn't it? Or right about the same time when they did
Uh,
did that? Wasn't that GTA 2
or
roughly?
3, I think.
No, it wasn't 3. Three's
Oh no, you're right. No, yeah, it would
yeah.
have been earlier.
Yeah. So there's just not a lot of London video games. I know I'm forgetting an important one. Someone's gonna go, but that's
Yeah,
okay.
I just don't know of any.
But no one's really done that to this day. Recreating an entire city, no matter what, is a big endeavor. I mean, no one really does. No one does that. I don't know if there's any game that really faithfully recreates an entire city. They recreate significant parts of cities, like L.A. Noire recreates a lot of that area, and to be fair, Spider-Man probably recreates a lot of. I don't know which island it's on, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know of anything that recreates a city, and that in the early 2000s proved to be a big technological feat for Team Soho too. They stood up and said we can do it, and then they got started doing it and realized maybe we can't do it. In the end, admittedly, they were only able to create about 10 square miles. Still not bad. In those 10 square miles, they really managed to be faithful to those 10 square miles. They got the licensing rights to a ton of vehicles. So it had, the right vehicles on the streets that were actual licensed. I think they said, God, I can't remember the manufacturer. It wasn't one of the big ones that we would know. There was only one manufacturer that told them no, and it was because they didn't want their cars being shown driving over the speed limit. And in the interview I read that in, McNamara was like, "What game doesn't show cars over their speed limit?" I can't remember what it is. It's something that definitely isn't here. It was distinctly a European manufacturer, which is so I don't know. But all your big ones that you would expect. They licensed them. They licensed actual weapons. They did a really great job faithfully recreating what they did. So instead of trying to go for quantity, they went for quality. But the truth of the matter is that faithfully recreating London was just much more technologically difficult than the team was originally expecting. So they got to work on that, and in the meantime, Sony is kind of hyping them up. The hype engine has left the station and it is going full steam ahead. People were excited to see how these killer apps would compare, to be fair. A little bit before E3 2002, a bunch of screenshots were shared with the public, which fed that fire. And so when E3 came around, people were kind of expecting to see this game, but they did not. It was not shown to the public at E3 2002. Instead, they kind of showed that prototype that they kind of already worked on behind closed doors and said, this is where we get the idea from and this is what we're working on. But that was still enough to give the people that were shown it, which was journalists, a little bit to go off of. And that was, again, enough to jump on the hype train. And if it was going fast then, it's going faster now. So people were even more excited after that. And that was a good thing at that point, because by that point, the project had really outgrown itself. It was said to have exceeded its budget many times over. And then some is how it was put. Sony Computer Entertainment Europe was literally bleeding money. So Sony Computer Entertainment boss Phil Harrison, he basically decided to cancel a bunch of other titles and close their studios in order to throw the money that they were putting on those games into the Getaway. So like Sony Computer Entertainment Europe's Manchester studio and Leeds studio, they were both shuttered. Their games were canceled, the studios were closed, and all of the resources that were being put into whatever they were working on were all redirected here to Team Soho so they could finish the Getaway. They could finish their killer app.
Mm-hmm.
That was the goal. So a lot of hope, a lot of faith was put into this game. It needed to live up to the hype, right? They threw $10 million into its marketing budget and just laid into the fact that it was going to be the killer app and recreate a city to the likes that you've never seen before. And that $10 million was again fueling the fire as Team Soho was wrapping up the game. It was serious business. But because of the technology they were up against and the overpromising, so to speak, that game was delayed. But the team managed to put a game together, and in the end, they finished it. And the Getaway was released to the world on December 11th, 2002. Rob, as we talk about the Getaway and its focus on blending storytelling with action, it reminds me how much easier it is these days to tell your own story, especially if you want to start your own podcast.
Yeah, creating an immersive experience like The Getaway must have taken a lot of work, but starting a podcast? That seems like a whole other challenge. Where would I even begin?
Well, that's where Zencaster comes in. Zencaster is an all in one podcasting platform that makes it incredibly easy to record high quality audio and video right from your web browser. No complicated setups, no expensive gear, just log in and start recording.
So I don't need a massive production team to get started? I can
Mm-mm.
just hit record and tell my story?
Exactly. Zencaster's post production tools make you sound like a pro even if you're just starting out. It automatically removes background noise, levels your audio, and even cleans up those awkward pauses or filler words like and I got lots of those. You don't hear them because it removes them. It's like having your own editor to make sure your podcast is ready to share with the world.
That sounds a lot easier than navigating through London's streets in The Getaway. But once I've recorded, how do I get my podcast out there?
That's the best part. Zencaster helps you distribute your podcast to all the major platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts right from their site. It's never been easier to get your voice out there and build an audience.
Sounds like the perfect getaway plan for my podcast. How can our listeners get started?
Well, that's simple. Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code, all one word, memory card lane. You'll get 30% off the first month of any Zencaster paid plan. Whether you're launching your very first podcast or looking to improve your current one, Zencaster makes it easy to get professional results.
All right, listeners, if you've ever wanted to tell your own story, now's the time to do it. Start your podcast and get it out there.
That's right. Head over to zencaster.com/pricing and use our offer code memory card lane, all one word, and you'll get 30% off the first month. Start your podcast journey today.
All right, let's get back to racing through London in the getaway.
So admittedly, the Getaway was decently received when it was released in December of 2002. Its aggregate score on Metacritic is about a 72. Not going to blow you away, but that's not the poorest showing in the world. There may be other reasons for that, admittedly. It was released the same week as Grand Theft Auto, one of the Grand Theft Autos. I think Vice City, if I'm not mistaken. So, when you're up against that, it's kind of hard to compare. Let's be honest about that. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, yeah, Vice City. It was released about the same time as Vice City. And the Grand Theft Auto series were excellent games. And when you make another open world game similar to that, where you're trying to recreate a city and do everything, people are going to compare. So, this game, it basically had a mountain to climb, and it didn't necessarily do it. A former developer on the game has said that he saw sales numbers worldwide of the first Getaway in the vicinity of about 4 million units. 4 million units isn't terrible sales for any game, let alone a game in the early 2000s. And that's not bad in any way, shape, or form. So, of course, the team is asked to work on a sequel. We got a sequel roughly a year later in 2004 as The Getaway Black Monday. For that sequel, the team continued to pull from classic British gangster films like The Long Good Friday and Lock, Stock, and Two Smoking Barrels. Black Monday, though, was not received very well. It has an aggregate score of 57 on Metacritic. I will say I do remember The Getaway. I do remember the hype around The Getaway, and Driver was fantastic, right? I remember I said it already this episode. We had real traffic lights and that, but now we were getting into the ability to visit real life locations that I probably would never visit otherwise in a video game. And was that was another mind-blowing concept. That was another concept that we never thought possible. Those are things that we take for granted nowadays, but that was just non-existent, that you could faithfully recreate a real life location, so much so that people who live there would be able to recognize. One of the first things they ever shown of this game, they recreated the states around their own office faithfully. That was where they started. What's what they knew. And so people could literally point out landmarks that they were used to all the time. And that was such a novel concept. That was just, they were awesome. Things like that were awesome. I don't think we get to appreciate that anymore, which is unfortunate. Now we appreciate the opposite end, right? When someone really creates a world of their own that draws you in. I think it's a different kind of world building. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that I'm sure there's some games out there that show like Detroit or New Orleans, but probably not to the level of detail like what's going on here.
Nah, I think it's a different kind of detail, to be honest. I mean, Red Dead Redemption has likenesses. There's a New Orleans likeness in there.
Well, yeah, but that game's based in the freaking 1700s.
Mafia 3 takes place in New Orleans, if I'm not mistaken. I've never played it because it wasn't good from my understanding, but. I,
Fair
I
enough.
just I just
Make a liar out
think
of me.
no, you're right. But I think that the tendency nowadays, the impressive part, is when someone can build a world out of their imagination and it's fully realized. We are at the point where the technology to recreate real life is there. And that's not very impressive because I mean, just Rob, I mean, we kind of got to experience it with Unreal Engine 5, right? Remember the first demo we ever saw of Unreal Engine 5?
No.
You don't when they came out with like the Matrix and the city demo and it was like a realistic looking city. You don't remember that at all?
No.
Ah. So, I guess that's the point. When Unreal Engine 5 came out, its photorealism was what was talked up and its early demos are all like, hey, this looks real, but this is actually a video game graphics engine. And so we're kind of at it now to where we're like, we get some of the awe of recreating real life because now the graphics engines are starting to lean towards photorealism and we're trying to achieve that without the uncanny valley, so to speak. but I still think that people aren't as excited as much for recreating real life places because it's so common. All the racing games faithfully recreate the tracks, and we talked about games like Spider-Man, and that recreates New York, and that's just we do that now. We do that now. We didn't do that back when. Faithfully recreating cities was not a thing at the time. And so my argument is that I think it's more impressive when someone creates a fantasy world and it's fully realized. I think there's more to be taken away from that. That's what I feel like that's what people go for nowadays, more so than the real life likeness. So either way, we got a sequel in 2004, The Getaway Black Monday. Again, it was not received well. The team gave it an aggregate score on Metacritic. It's got a 57. Its sales numbers were said to be about 2 million copies. So it still sold decently well. And because of that, the team was given the ability. Now it would have been Team London, Team Soho. We talked about Psygnosis getting wrapped up into Sony. Team Soho was wrapped up too, and eventually a bunch of what was left British studios were all put together, and they became London Studio, if I'm not mistaken. So at this point, we're post Team Soho. We're in the Sony phase, specifically Sony phase, and they're getting an opportunity to make a third game in the franchise because 4 million copies, 2 million copies, still decent enough number of copies to make it financially viable to want to create a third game. And speaking of the PlayStation Portable, Rob, the PSP, the third game in the series was created for the PSP. It was a action adventure game where you can play as one member of 5 different games called Gangs of London. Again, lukewarm reception, sits with a 52 score on Metacritic, so they slide down the scale every time, right?
Yep.
And interestingly enough, now we have one okay game at a 72 and then two really poor games at 57, 52. You'd think that now with the trends, because who wants to go lower than the 52, that Sony would have said, nah, we don't want that. But realistically, the series was allowed to live on after that. It wasn't completely nixed. We don't see that very often where we have two not successful games and then they get to do it again.
Well, you say not successful. I mean, 57, 52, what's their cost to produce versus the
True.
money they brought in? Because the 52 could have still made million plus dollars profit.
And that's a valid point. That's why we get trash games like that over and over again, because if it's so cheap to make nowadays, it's a little different because they can just do resource reskins, right? They can reskin a game and resell it as a different game, and that then you make a lot of money. Looking at
Or
you,
make
Call
it
of
the same
Duty.
game but call it different and just remove a character like Overwatch.
I'm looking at you, Call of Duty.
Looking at you, Blizzard.
Looking at you, Activision. That's also Blizzard now. You win.
Yeah, pretty much hit the nail on the head with that one.
Yeah, for sure. We don't see that very often. They tend to nix series after one or two failures, or they put them away for a while, which admittedly is exactly what they did here. Gangs of London was 2006, and admittedly, we didn't hear anything about the Getaway series, as it was called at that point, until 2020. And then, surprisingly enough, it was picked up, optioned, as a television series.
Hmm.
In 2020, Gangs of London was turned into a TV series. It was first broadcast on Sky Atlantic. That's a British pay cable station. It was on Sky Atlantic for its first season. And then the rights were bought out by AMC, and the first season and a subsequent second season were brought over here to the United States. I believe they announced a third. I don't know if there was a third. The Wikipedia wasn't updated. I believe there is, but in any case, people were excited for Gangs of London, but by Sky Atlantic measurements, its first season debuted at like 2.23 million viewers. That was actually the second best drama debut on that station ever. Rotten Tomatoes has its first season at a 91%. Means that people genuinely liked the show, right?
Yeah.
The second season sitting at an 81%, which I mean, probably means it just didn't meet the lofty expectations set by the first one, to be fair. But because of the success of the first season, there is also a graphic novel that has been published called Gangs of London Stories Ghosts. Just we kind of call it Ghosts. And that's set like a little story that's set between the first and second seasons of the television series. So the series got to live on. Like we had noted in the midst of all this, Team Soho, the developer on the Getaway, was eventually merged with Studio Camden, and then they collectively became London Studio. Now, London Studio has continued for a long time. London Studio created SingStar. That's a karaoke series that has been incredibly popular for Sony. There's been a ton of SingStar titles, and they've made all of them at London Studio. It also made a lot of software for Sony's iToy, their first little camera toy for, I think iToy was the PS2 era. There was iToy Play. I think there was 3 plays all made by London Studio. There was iToy Groove, iToy Chat, iToy Kinetic, and iToy Operation Spy. So they made a bunch of software for the iToy. As this was happening, they were frequently called upon to assist some of the bigger studios at Sony with their AAA titles. So, like London Studio helped make Killzone 2. They worked some on Little Big Planet. Anytime those teams got into a crunch or just needed, I mean help in general, London Studio was tagged in. But as SingStar and the iToys interest waned, another technology was taking its place, and that was virtual reality. So London Studio transitioned into making virtual reality technology for Sony. They basically made one of the rendering pipelines that Sony uses on the PlayStation VR for their first person titles. That rendering software was first used in PlayStation VR Worlds, which was like their little showcase. I don't remember if that came with the VR or not, but they had their showcase. And there was one game in it that was basically like, I think it was literally a London recreation that people could, look at a certain area in VR. And people liked it so much that London Studio turned that into an entire video game, a VR title called Blood and Truth that came out in 2019. So they've been doing things throughout the years.
Definitely.
In 2022, it was announced that London Studio was working on a cooperative multiplayer title set in modern fantasy version of London. So they were kind of working on returning to their roots of faithfully creating London. But since 2022, we know that the whole industry has been struggling. A lot of things have changed in the industry for the past 2 years. And in 2024, Sony closed the studios as part of, a whole range of layoffs they announced. I think they did it back in May. So as of May of 2024, there is no longer a London studio. And as for Brendan McNamara, the creator slash director of the original Getaway, he eventually left Team Soho to move back to Australia. In Australia, he opened a studio called Team Bondi. Team Bondi has exactly one credit to its name. It's a game that probably deserves its own episode, LA Noir, which we kind of vaguely talked about earlier in this. And I will leave it at that because LA Noir is interesting and the rest of McNamara's career. Um, so we will talk about that another time. But I think that about sums it up. That's the saga of the Getaway series, Rob. What
Intriguing it was.
what kind of started out as a just a hey, let's make a free roaming racing game, eventually turned into Sony's hope for their killer app that didn't quite live up to expectations. And despite that, they were allowed to keep making it for years, and then they weren't, and then it became a TV show, and then it wasn't. So,
I mean, it seems like it had to have done kind of well for there to be a TV show.
well, to be fair, there was a resurgence of British gangster stuff then. I mean, we got a bunch of Guy Ritchie, The Gentleman, and some movies too. It was riding the British gangster resurgence that we got in 2020 in that little period, and it was a good franchise, good opportunity It was already there. It was already written. Like the background, the hard work was already done. You know what I mean?
True. Very true.
So I'm not saying that it's not good enough to recreate. Obviously, it had to be, but it was right time, right place for the franchise to get re-optioned and turned into a television series. So
Well, I mean, look what happened with Twisted Metal too. Seems Sony has a knack for that.
yeah, Twisted Metal. I'm excited for a new season of Twisted Metal for sure.
More so than a new game because the last game sucked.
Yeah, they need to. They need definitely need to recreate that.
That's
There's
what
a
I'm saying, man. Sony has this habit of these games that kind of end up sucking. They start out okay and then they suck in the end. They're like TV, and then we're like, yeah. We forget the
yeah.
crappy games.
So we talked about DMA design, and we talked about Psygnosis, we talked about the other Sony computer entertainment, Little Big Planet, the studio that made that, and Killzone. These are all things that we've touched on in other episodes. There's a lot of history that goes into history that goes on top of history, and that's what we talk about every week. So if you'd like to check out any of these old episodes, I would encourage you to do so, first of all, anywhere that you get your podcasts, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, any which way, but also where we prefer you coming and visiting us is our website, www.memorycardlane.com. Rob, what else can people do on our website?
You can find a calendar of our upcoming episode topics. You can find a link to our Discord where you can come chat with Dave and I. A link to our Patreon where you can get access to ad-free and unedited versions of all of our episodes with the removal of all those ums and uhs that Dave talked about previously. And you can find a link to our social medias where I am on several platforms as Rob_O_Raptor and Dave.
I can be found on various platforms as David is Wrong. Each week, we'll tell you a story relevant to the current week in gaming history. It can be about a game, a technology, a person. I've done it on places before. It's just something that I want to talk about that I can somehow tie to the publication week of this episode. Every week when I sit down, I look for things that I don't know. That's the fun of doing this for me. I get to research, I get to learn new things, and I get excited because when I learn new things, I get to teach all of you new things. I think it's a fantastic cycle of teaching and learning, learning and teaching. And in celebration of that cycle, we like to talk about what we take away each week. So, Rob, what did you learn today?
Oh, I had never heard of this series before, so it was an entirely new learning experience. But what I do think is impressive is just, thinking of the technology for the time and the spatial constraints and whatnot and hardware limitations. It's really impressive to think that even though it wasn't quite the 70 that they had anticipated or hoped for, 10 square miles of London is still pretty freaking impressive for a PlayStation 2 game, in my opinion.
Agreed. And they didn't have a blueprint. There wasn't open world games. I mean, we were a few years removed from Grand Theft Auto Vice City, or I mean, three and then Vice City, right?
Yeah, for sure.
We Three was the first one, and we were still learning that. There wasn't a blueprint for them to go to and say, "This is how you do this." Nowadays you can go on, because we have the Unreal and we have the Unity engines, and you can literally go on to their stores. They have asset stores, and you can literally buy a rendering pipeline that will only render what you're looking at. That's how they do big worlds and big games like this, is that they only render what you're looking at. Otherwise the computer would get overwhelmed if it had to redraw everything at one time.
Hmm.
That's how we do things like that, but back when we didn't know that. Like this is still that period where these were trailblazers, where they literally had to design their rendering tools themselves to learn how to do things like that. And I'm always in awe of that concept every time I stop and think about it. So
Yeah, so pretty amazing, pretty ingenious. So that's it for me. What about you?
I remember the Getaway. I didn't think it was a bad game, but we both know I'm a lot more forgiving than other people of video games. So, and it was a good gangster story. I enjoy gangster stories. So most of this was new for me, to be honest with you. I'd never really thought about the Getaway since I played it in the early 2000s, right? Hadn't thought about it in years. So that was fun thinking about it and just learning. I know Brendan McNamara because I know Team Bondi. I know LA Noir story because if you were involved in video games and what was going on in video games, you know Eleanor's story, but I never really paid attention to where he came from. Didn't know he did the Getaway. Didn't know he worked for Psygnosis before that. Had to dig for that information. So that was kind of interesting learning some background to McNamara. Filled in a little bit of a knowledge gap that I never had up until this point.
Right on.
All right, Rob. Well, before I take it out of here and look forward to next week, is there anything that you'd like to add to today's episode?
As always, I'll take a quick moment to say thank you so much to our listeners for listening. It means the world to us, and we hope that you enjoy getting to learn a little bit about the games that inspired our modern gaming with us each week. So, thank you.
All right, ladies and gents, that brings us to the end of our look at The Getaway. From its intense car chases to its realistic recreation of London streets, The Getaway pushed the boundaries of what an action adventure game could look like in the mid 2000s. Though it wasn't without its challenges, the game's focus on cinematic storytelling and gritty realism left a lasting mark on the industry at the time. Whether you're revisiting it or discovering it for the first time, The Getaway remains an intriguing part of gaming history. Go check it out. Next week, though, we're taking a trip into the world of Baldur's Gate, one of the most beloved RPGs of all time. We'll explore how Baldur's Gate brought the Dungeons and Dragons universe to life in video games, setting the standard for isometric RPGs with deep storytelling, tactical combat, and unforgettable characters. So gather your party and join us next week for another epic adventure down memory card lane. Do the thing.
Skibby doom dap dap, driving cars in London.